You're right, folks, and welcome back. Blackrock Caverns, probably the first 5-man you will come across in Cata Classic, and for the most part, a pretty decent dungeon with mechanically simple boss fights that are also very punishing should you fail those mechanics. So, let's go over their mans, any noteworthy mobs or packs in between. First things first, you have the Chamber of Incineration pretty much as soon as you zone into the instance. This is where you will find the first boss, Rom'ogg Bonecrusher, a big-ass ogre in dire need of an orthodontist. He patrols the entire chamber area. As such, it is best to wait for him to wander off so you can pick off the packs of ads around the NPC you've almost certainly clocked chilling in the middle of the room, Raz the Crazed. Once you've done the first 2 or 3 initial packs to the instance, you can either keep on clearing or wait for the boss to patrol back round to Raz before engaging him, making use of the space you've already cleared out behind you. Personally, the latter is what I would recommend as it reduces the chance of the boss being ass-pulled whilst you're in the middle of dealing with a trash pack. Rom'ogg then. As I said at the start of the video, mechanically simple, but failure to pay attention to the mechanics will result in death, regardless of gear. Now, I had 359 gear, as does most of the beta at this point, which is equivalent to normal raid items. You will still get one shot if you ignore mechanics while in gear similar to this, so paying heed to what's going on in this fight is paramount. It's a very simple stack and spread fight. When you engage the boss, he will call out to any pack around him, and as you're probably seeing on screen right now, it does get a bit messy. Early on, this is likely to be a death sentence, but with gear, it shouldn't be too big an issue should it happen. But just remember to clear enough packs. You've then got Chains of Woe. At the 66% and 33% intervals, the boss will pull all players in front of him and root them in place. In order to free yourselves, you need to break the chains, and since this is the post-nerf version of the instance, the chains are made of cardboard and will just fall down. Focus them, yes, but it's not likely, even in crap gear, you won't be able to shatter them before the most important part of the encounter happens. And that is the Skullcracker. After casting Chains of Woe, the boss starts winding up this ability. After 8 seconds, he will inflict a large amount of damage on any player who was within 12 yards of him. Basically, unless you are a very well-geared, and I mean raid-geared tank, or plate DPS with a cooldown on hand, you're gonna be one-shot. That's it. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. This thing is meant to kill you. It's not something you outplay. You run away, or you die. That is its entire purpose, so learn this lesson well. Well, then you've got Quake, an ability the boss will do throughout the entire fight, which does unremarkable periodic damage to everyone in the group for 3 seconds. After 3 seconds, the ground ruptures and inflicts a chunk of physical damage to any player within 4 yards of one of the cracks. Basically, keep spread and don't stack. But, with that said, in my testing, this ability did very little damage and wasn't really a threat at all. I'd still argue caution in the early days, just in case it launches and shatters everyone's spines, but I doubt you'll overly notice its ability at all. And on Heroic only, after the ground ruptures, an Angered Earth will spawn per alive player and start attacking. Again, haven't seen them be anything other than a mild nuisance, so pick them up and cleave. The boss will also use Wounding Strike on his current aggro target. It's a less impressive Mortal Strike, inflicting 125% melee damage and reducing healing to the target by 25%. Honestly, I didn't even notice it was happening until I was rewatching my footage back and checking notes, so I doubt this ability will actually frazzle anyone. Moving on past Rom'ogg, you'll run into some evolved Twilight Zealots, but fear not. After killing the first boss, Raz the Crazed wakes up and starts battering anyone in his path, namely these Zealots. On their own, they're manageable, but in numbers they will mince you, especially if you're a lesser geared group. The Zealots have a few abilities of note. Force Blast. This inflicts physical damage to an enemy and knocks them down. Gravity Strike, an ability for your tanks. It deals 60% of their current HP and reduces attack power for a short time. Grievous Whirl, a cleave that'll put a dot on the target and tick every 3 seconds for 30 seconds, or until the target is fully healed. And lastly, Shadow Strike. Much like other variants of this ability, the mob will shadow step behind the target and inflict an arseload of damage. This can and should be interrupted at all times. The next area is the Halls of Awakening, where you will find the second boss, Corla, Herald of Twilight. Here you'll find a couple of stray evolved zealots that you'll need to take care of yourself, but as I said, in isolation they are more than manageable, as well as some standard zealots, and that comes with a whole load of random abilities that honestly, you're not gonna notice. The only thing worth going over here is that they have an interrupt, a standard kick. So if you're a caster, particularly the healer, don't be in melee range. On to the boss then. Only really one ability here that's noteworthy. You will notice that before the boss are 3 kneeling zealots. When you engage, they start acquiring stacks of evolution. At 100 stacks, they transform into one of the aforementioned evolved Twilight zealots with all of the abilities therein. The point of the fight is to prevent these zealots from evolving by having players stand in the beams that are powering them up. However, if a player stands in these beams and gets 100 stacks, they too will evolve into a big-ass Draconid and become hostile with all the same abilities as the evolved mobs. The whole point of the fight is to rotate players in and out of these beams to prevent anyone from turning into a big-ass angry Dragon Man. Personally, I found it best if the tank positions the boss in between 2 of the adds, and the healer and perhaps one of the ranged players keep an eye on the furthest away zealot, tagging in where needed. The evolution debuff, although it stacks, does have a timer and will drop after 15 seconds, and some magical defensives can even prevent stacks from building entirely. A Death Knight's anti-magic shell is a fine example of this, as the debuff itself doesn't actually do any damage, so you get the full duration of the defensive to just outright prevent stacks from gaining. It also means that the NPCs can actually take a few stacks themselves, as it takes 20 seconds to reach the full 100. So if you need a few seconds to wait for your debuff to drop, don't panic. Execute this correctly, and that's the fight. Seriously, it's that simple. Fail, however, and you will get overwhelmed by Draconids. The boss does have 2 other abilities. You've got Aura of Acceleration, which increases the movement speed of nearby mobs by 50% and their attack speed by 15%, but is a completely dead ability assuming you don't screw up the beams. And Dark Command. This is a fear that does some shadow damage. This can and should be interrupted to prevent a player being feared out of or into a beam and potentially screwing the entire fight. The room following on is the Twilight Forge. Here are a few trogs you probably aren't ever going to bother with, and 2 conflagrations. These are fire elementals and they hurt, even in raid gear. They will kill you. They have a few abilities. Firstly is Burning Heat, which does fire damage to players and causes the blobs of Quicksilver on the ground to become active. You've got Heat Exhaustion, which is an AoE that reduces player health and movement speed by 10%. And stacks, and then you've got Immolate, which does a chunk of fire damage up front with a dot that ticks every 3 seconds for 15 seconds. Now, there are only 2 of these mobs, and like I said, they are nasty. It's the only part of the instance where I noticed people were actively taking heavy hits outside of a boss, and particularly early on, pulling both of them could very well kill an undergeared group. So I would advise caution and pull them one by one if you can. And once they're dead, you can have a crack at the boss, Karsh Steelbender. This boss has basically one ability, and it revolves around that big stream of lava in the middle of the room. The boss will come with a buff called Quicksilver Armor, which reduces all damage he takes by 99%. To remove this buff, you need to have him stand in the big beam of lava. This heats up his armor and removes the 99% reduction, and in fact increases the damage he takes by 5%, stacking for every second he's in the lava stream. However, as he gains stacks, he will do an increasing amount of AoE fire damage to the group based on how many stacks he has. This means you do not want to just leave him in the lava stream, as you will find yourself dead pretty quickly. Personally, after about 5 or 6 stacks, I pull him out. He'll have a 25-30% increased damage debuff, and that's more than you'll really ever need. However, the superheated Quicksilver Armor debuff only lasts for 17 seconds, so after this window the process will need to be repeated as his 99% damage reduction buff returns, and when the superheated debuff drops, the grates surrounding the central beam erupt and anyone stood on them will take a serious chunk of fire damage, so try to be either in the centre ring or just outside. And on Heroic, when this happens, 3 bound flame mobs will spawn, and like the Angered Earth on the first boss, they're barely an inconvenience. Just try and get them to melee for cleave, but even then, I wouldn't overly bother, they're just sort of there. The boss also does added fire damage to his primary target when superheated, which multiplies depending on his stacks, which is yet another incentive to not go too high, particularly if you're a touch undergeared. And there is also a standard cleave, so tanks face him away from your friends and everyone else stand behind him. Onto the final area of the instance, the Scar of the Worldbreaker. The packs here aren't overly noteworthy either, and you will probably skip most of them. But for those you do kill, there are only really a couple of abilities worth going over. First is Shadow Prison, cast by Twilight Obsidian Borers. Think Heroic Blood Council. It's the same thing. If this debuff is on you, you take ticking shadow damage that increases per stack you have. The stacks increase when you move. However, it is a magic ability and should be able to be dispelled, but it will kill folk who aren't paying attention. The second is Meteor, which is cast by Defiled Earth Ragers. Basically, someone in the group will be targeted by one of these adds and a meteor will be dropped on their heads and do a significant amount of damage, particularly early on to the undergeared. It's also way too fast to be able to run away from. However, the damage is split between all players within 8 yards of the impact, so stack when you're fighting these guys because it will just make your healer's life a lot easier. Now, bosses, there are 2 in this area. First is Beauty, the counterpart to UBRS's Beast. She comes with a complement of tiny corehounds. Beauty herself has a few tricks up her sleeve. There's Berserker Charge, a charge that knocks back an enemy and does a chunk of physical damage. Flame Break, an AoE that does fire damage and knocks nearby enemies back. Terrifying Roar, a 5-second fear. Magma Spit, which does some upfront fire damage, followed by a dot that ticks every 3 seconds for 9 seconds and explodes when removed. And finally, Berserk. And as with any Berserk ability, it's basically lights out. However, her Berserk is only triggered by the death of Runty, one of her 4 pups. However, this pup does not engage when the fight begins, and is in fact just potting around behind his mother. So in a standard run, just steer clear of him. As for her other pups, on Heroic, only 2 of the remaining 3 will spawn, and unlike normal where you can pull them out one by one without pulling the boss, on Heroic they are all linked and come as a package deal. The pups come with 2 abilities, Little Big Flame Breath, which is just a conal flame attack, and Lava Drool, which is simply unmissable orange lava spots on the floor you don't want to stand in. There are 2 ways of handling this boss really. CC the pups to the best of your ability while steering clear of Runty at the back, or the second, which is just simply tank and spank. Pick up Beauty and her 2 pups and just focus the big dog down. Beauty's abilities aren't actually all that dangerous, and so long as the tank and the healer are able and willing, just keep moving out of the puddles and as much AoE as you can, and the boss will fall down. She's probably the easiest boss in here by some margin, and the only one I've had to do 0 explaining on during testing. And then we've reached the final boss, Ascendant Lord Obsidius. The main ability to note here is Transformation. The boss is joined by 3 shadows of himself that at the 69% and 34% intervals will swap places with him. These shadows cannot be killed and can't necessarily be tanked in the traditional fashion, as they attack the target who's most recently attacked them, not the target with the highest threat. Again, calling back to the Blood Council, but this time with the Shadow Orbs. Other than this, the shadows have one more ability called Crepuscular Veil, meaning when they hit their target, healing done to that target will be reduced by 24%, stacking up to 4 times. So ideally, you want someone other than your tank kiting them around the place. With that said, in my testing, particularly in melee heavy groups, this was a non-issue, and they could very easily be stacked with the boss, as they just end up bouncing between the tanks and melee DPSers. Even when the debuff was on the tank, I never noticed it being an issue at all. The boss himself does also have a few other abilities. You've got Stone Blow, an attack that does 150% of normal melee damage and stuns his current target, i.e. the tank, for 1 second. Twilight Corruption, a shadow dot ticking every 2 seconds for 12 seconds, and is just really easily healable. And then you've got Thunderclap, which does a chunk of nature damage and reduces the movement speed of anyone within 25 yards, by 50%. If you are doing the kiting tactic, this is the ability your kiter doesn't want to get hit by, so avoid the boss at all costs. And that's Blackrock Caverns. Not a bad first foray into 5-mans this expansion, and probably one you'll all become very familiar with very soon. If you've any questions or queries, do let me know down below, but for now, that is me. If you start Karsh, like, sub, share your pals, and so on, that'll be grand. Have a good one, folks. Bye for now!